Um, First of all, I think it's time now to start this webinar. So the first thing I'd like to do is to welcome everyone, wherever you are, whether it's good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. And thank you all very much for joining us. First thing to do is to introduce myself. I'm Christine Jenkin. I'm a professorial research fellow at the Centre for Women, Peace and Security at the London School of Economics. And I'm very privileged to be chairing this important event on the humanitarian crisis in Tigray, Ethiopia. The event is co-hosted by the Firas Lauji Institute for Africa, which is an institute that connects social science disciplines and works in partnership with African institutions to bring African voices to global debates, and also with the LSE Department of International Development. And I think it's also important to note that the event is taking place during Refugee Week. So 3 years ago, the United Nations Security Council adopted Resolution 2417 on the protection of civilians in armed conflict. This was a groundbreaking resolution in its recognition of, to quote, the need to break the vicious cycle between armed conflict and food insecurity. It reiterated the primary responsibility of the Security Council under the United Nations Charter for the maintenance of international peace and security, and accordingly its commitment to address conflict-induced food insecurity, including famine. And while urging all parties to the conflict to comply with their obligations under international humanitarian law, the so-called laws of war, it also noted that the Council could consider adopting sanction measures where appropriate against individuals or entities that obstruct the delivery of humanitarian assistance or access to or distribution of such humanitarian assistance. So what the Security Council was doing was designating such behaviour as contrary to already existing international law. And in 1998, the drafters of the Rome Statute for the International Criminal Court, the international treaty that established that body, had also included, again to quote, intentionally using starvation of civilians as a method of warfare by depriving them of objects indispensable to their survival as a serious violation of the laws and customs applicable in international armed conflict. In other non-legal language, a war crime. And so to go back to the resolution, that requests the Secretary General to report swiftly to the Council when the risk of conflict-induced famine and widespread food insecurity in armed conflict contexts occurs, and expresses its intention to give its full attention to such information provided by the Secretary General when those situations are brought to its attention. So in the words of one of our speakers tonight, this Security Council resolution could have been specifically designed for events in Tigray in northern Ethiopia in late 2020 and 2021. There is a perfect storm of armed conflict, violence, including sexual violence, forced displacement and starvation, famine, in an area, of course, that has seen this before. Yet despite the promise of condemnation in the resolution and the legal designation by states of such behaviour as constituting, again to quote, one of the most serious crimes of concern to the international community as a whole, there has been largely silence within the various manifestations of the international community, or softening the situation as a humanitarian crisis. The Security Council is divided. It has discussed Tigray only in closed discussion, and there was another such discussion earlier this week. The apparent promise of action in Resolution 2417, including possible sanction, has not eventuated. Reports about what is really happening in that area are few, with communications largely blocked. So again, to quote one of the speakers, Professor Alex Duval, in a piece in the London Review of Books this month, in Tigray, in northern Ethiopia, a famine is unfolding in the dark. So the speakers in this event will cast some light on this darkness from a range of their different perspectives. So to turn to introduce the speakers, and in the order of their presentations, they are first of all Professor Alex Duval, who is an executive director of the World Peace Foundation at the Fletcher School, Tufts University in the US, and who has worked in Northeast Africa for 30 years, including as an advisor on Sudan to the African Union. Alex is also an investigator at the LSE Centre for Public Authority and International Development. Alex will be followed by Tamrat G. Gebremariam, who is the managing editor of the largest English weekly in Ethiopia, Fortune. He has nearly 30 years of experience in publishing, a member of the alumni of University of Georgetown School of Foreign Policy, a regular contributor to specialized international publications, such as the Global Integrities Index on Government Corruption, Transparency and Accountability. He also writes for Africa in Fact, a publication of Good Governance Africa, and its online blog, The Wicked Conversation. Tamrat will be followed by Tedale Lema, who's a journalist who for the last 10 years has played a crucial role in turning Addis Standard magazine into one of the most influential magazines in the history of independent media in Ethiopia. In 2014, Tedale was named one of the 50 rising stars on the continent by the leading Pan-African magazine, The Africa Report, and in 2015 became a member of the International Advisory Board of the Bandung Journal of the Global South. And then the final speaker is Tamarat Negera, who's a journalist and political commentator who's worked in broadcast, print and online media for many years as well. His journalism is informed by his study of theology and participation in the landmark 2005 election. In 2007, he co-founded and edited Addis Niger, a newspaper, before it was shut down ahead of the 2010 election and its founding editors being charged with terrorism. Tamarat then lived and studied in the US in exile until reform in Ethiopia, and after returning in September 2018, Tamarat co-founded Walker Media and Communications, a share company of 105 journalists and media professionals. So we have an extremely well-informed and informative panel of speakers. Each will speak for approximately 7 minutes. Following presentations, there will be a short discussion between these panelists, and then there'll be the opportunity for the audience to engage with the speakers. So at this point, if people who are listening would like to think about any questions they would like to ask, and submit them through the question and answer function on Zoom. So without further ado, I'll turn to the first speaker, Alex.
Thank you very much. I would like to say that it's a pleasure to be with you, but this is really such a dismal subject that it's not a pleasure to talk about. I want to make the case that actually the outlines of what is happening, the big picture, is really quite simple and clear. 3 points. Number one, there is a famine. Number two, it is man-made, it is criminal. And number three, the international community is failing to meet its obligations. So a region that was food secure a year ago is now in the throes of famine. More than 5 million people need emergency food assistance. According to a very cautious, minimal estimate by the United Nations deriving from the Ethiopian government's own data collection interagency survey conducted in partnership with the UN, 350,000 of them are in famine conditions. This is the most severe such crisis for 10 years. And there is no indication that it is getting any less. To the contrary, it is likely to intensify and spread. And the humanitarian crisis will not be just confined to Tigray either. There are many concerns about the rest of Ethiopia. It is entirely man-made. So what are the key reasons for this? The primary reason is a campaign of starvation conducted by three belligerent forces: the Ethiopian National Defense Force, the Eritrean Defense Forces, and Amhara militia. And they have committed a huge array of war crimes here. Crimes of pillage, very, very systematic, widespread looting of industries, of hotels, of farms, of shops, of people's houses. Destruction and rendering useless objects indispensable to the survival of the civilian population, the legal definition of a starvation crime, which is not just food. This can also include water, ripping up basic water infrastructure. It can also include health, the vandalization and the looting of the great majority of the health infrastructure of the region. It can also include depriving children of maternal care. And so sexual and gender-based violence, rape, is a crime. But rape in this context can also be a starvation crime, because a woman who is a survivor of rape may not be able to care for herself or for her children. And there are tens of thousands of unaccompanied children in Tigray, many of whom are unaccompanied because their mothers were abducted, systematically raped, and are either still in captivity held by their abductors or are now in hospital or in hiding. And those children are among the most vulnerable to starvation. And of course, the fear of rape is also a factor which means that women and girls will not be able to conduct activities indispensable to survival. They will not be able to travel on the roads. They will be fearful of running the gauntlet of checkpoints manned by Ethiopian and Eritrean soldiers. And we know from comparative research around the world that when sexual crimes are committed with this gravity on this scale, it is not just individual soldiers misbehaving. It happens because there are instructions, there is latitude, there is a direct, often a very direct order given, though sometimes not in very candid language. So this is a key element in the starvation. And of course, there is forced displacement. And the forced displacement includes the removal of the Tigrayan population from the most fertile areas of the region. These areas that were contested, there are legitimate claims by both the Amhara and Tigray region to these areas. And I don't want to pass judgment on what would, who, as it were, legitimately originally owns these areas. But what is clear is that the forcible displacement of the population from these areas is a major contributor to mass displacement and starvation, not only because of the mass displacement, but because at least 1 million Tigrayans relied on migrant labor in those areas in order to sustain themselves. It seems that the intent is not just to create starvation now, but to reduce Tigray to a state of utter dependency. The other factors here, there's the factor that has gained most international attention, which is the choking off of international assistance. The United Nations, the World Food Programme, gives rather optimistic figures that it's reaching more than 1 million people. That generally means it has reached over the course of the conflict on one occasion up to 1.6 million people. Those people may have received one ration only. Sometimes they've received 2. And quite often, the criteria used for saying aid has been delivered is that the truck has been offloaded and someone has signed for it. There are quite a number of instances in which that food that was offloaded was then loaded onto another truck, usually an Eritrean army truck, and used to feed the Eritrean troops. Those figures privately, what we are told is those figures given out, the official figures, are considerable exaggerations. There are about 1.5 million people in the areas controlled by the Tigray Defense Forces who have received either nothing or next to nothing. The great majority of Tigrayans are receiving pitiful amounts. And then there is the war. This is not a war that is going to be over quickly. The government has announced what it calls the final offensive in the last few weeks. It has amassed its troops. It is fighting alongside its coalition partner from Eritrea. We have been told in November, again in January, February, again in March, April, that this will be the final offensive, that the Tigrayan resistance will be eliminated. It hasn't worked, and there is no indication that any such military victory is in prospect. The Tigrayans have mobilized. For them, this is now a fight for their very survival. They may not have the sophisticated equipment, the armaments, but they have the determination and they have the leadership. This war will not be over soon. None of the parties has shown a positive response to calls for a humanitarian ceasefire. So what is the international response? As Christine said, this is an issue that ought to have been put before the UN Security Council back in November. It's not only a threat to international peace and security, partly because of the involvement of Eritrea as a major belligerent, partly because of the spillover effects, but also because of Resolution 2417 and this grave humanitarian crisis. This has not happened. This has not happened because the Russians and Chinese have threatened vetoes, but it has also not happened because the African nations represented at the Security Council have not stepped up. They have hid behind the old excuse, the old shield that we thought had been discredited 25 years ago of the sovereign privilege of a government to do what it liked to its own population behind the shield of sovereignty. This discredited doctrine has been resurrected and unfortunately is being endorsed. The African Union has failed on this. So the immediate prospect, I'm afraid, is that the war is going to continue. The international response is pitifully inadequate. And unless there is a change of heart by the principal belligerents, that is Addis Ababa and Asmara, under pressure or for some other reason, we are going to see the deaths, needless and criminal deaths by starvation of tens of thousands, probably hundreds of thousands of chiefly children in Tigray over the coming months. Thank you. You're still muted, Christine.
Thank you, Alex, for that very sobering and distressing account of what is happening and what it is that we are addressing in this event. So I'll turn without further ado to Temarat.
Thank you, Professor. I'm most honored to speak before you and your audience. I'd like to address the impact of the war in Tigray in light of or its impact on the economy in general. Granted, it's quite too early to determine the impact of the war in Tigray on the overall Ethiopian economy, and particularly the contribution of the Tigray regional state to the Ethiopian national economy. Data are not available yet, but you can estimate that 90% of the population in Tigray depends on humanitarian food assistance, according to UN data, and that shows you that much of the population is out of production. And Tigray's economy is based on largely agricultural production, industry, and services. And all these sectors are not functional because of the war that's happening right now. There are earlier, you can have an idea about the extent of the loss from Tigray regional state to the national economy, looking at the sectors that have not been operating for the last 6 months, and judging from data from last year, you can deduct that the quarterly revenue from the Tigray regional state is about 14 billion birr in terms of productivity, and there are about 7 sectors that have been exporting up to $3.5 million from that region. In general, Tigray's contribution to Ethiopia's GDP is estimated about 10%, and you can have that. You can understand that 10% of contribution from Tigray into the national economy has been lost. But the protracted conflict, so militarized conflict or war in Tigray, has its impact in positioning the Ethiopian economy into what economists call a war-footing economy, which is to say that it is characterized. The macroeconomic issues in Ethiopia is characterized into a raging civil war taking place in Tigray, popular discontent in the rest of the country, including a growing insurgency in the western part of Ethiopia, and the border tension with Sudan, and the geopolitical dispute with Egypt because of the GERD. So this brings Ethiopian economy from what once has been a very determined government to ensure economic growth by creating an aggregate demand. And that sort of thinking has been gone, that you do not find the current government singularly focused on creating an aggregate demand and pushing for economic growth. It's more of a policy driven by a supply side economics, where the issues about liberalizing the economy, opening it up, and depending on lifting public subsidies in power consumption, prices on fuel and sugar. This has created a situation where a very highly volatile political environment is where this major economic policy shifts are being undertaken. And the economy is affected by three parallel issues at the same time. One is a worrying increase in budget deficit, and a foreign currency crunch, and then inflation. And you can see that the war in Tigray has a pressure on the federal budget. And from what we have gathered so far, the Ethiopian government has spent all its military budget for the year within the 6 months up until December. And that shows to you the level of pressure the war in Tigray has on the federal budget. It's important to note that budget deficit is becoming a major source of work. Person, whether it is financed by grants and loans from external sources, or printing money, as has been the case for many years, or the treasury bill the government is issuing in order to sell to the local investors, largely the banks and the pension funds, will be determined how the economy will be functioning, and then how the war that's taking place in Tigray will be affecting the economy. From what we've seen, the government is hoping to finance 22% of its budget deficit from external grants and loans. And considering the tension the government has with Europe and the US, it's very likely that the grants and loans its authorities in Addis Ababa are hoping will not arrive. That will leave them to go in the course of financing it through treasury bills, sales, and printing money, or domestic borrowing from the National Bank, which amounts to printing money. And the broad money grows, or the amount of money that is put into the economy, or the growth of the amount of money that's put into the economy is on average 28%, which is much bigger and larger than what the IMF is recommending, that is at the 17%. So this leaves a situation of a perfect storm gathering momentum. The country is at war. Elections are causing political instability and uncertainty, and adding fuel to the fire, economic sanctions that is threatened by the European and the US government will worsen the situation. So it's pretty much a gloomy prospect for the national economy as a result of the war that's taking place in Tigray. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for that overview of the economic situation and sort of another factor to add into the perfect storm that we've already heard about. So Sadale, to hand over to you now.
Thank you very much. I'm very much happy to join this group to discuss about the humanitarian crisis in Tigray. Both Alex and Tamrat have chosen a very legitimate angle to discuss the impact of the war. Hence, my presentation will focus on the political impact of the ongoing war and what it means to be for all the belligerents not willing to stop or not heeding to the international call for cessation of hostilities, which has now, pay attention, has come down to cessation of hostilities for humanitarian access. It was coupled before, the call for cessation of hostilities was coupled with political dialogue between the warring factions. But I think the West is now giving up on that and watering down the call for cessation of hostilities only to allow humanitarian access for more than 5.5 million population of the Tigray regional state. So what does it mean politically? What is this doing to the Ethiopian body politics, that we have a government that is led by, don't forget, a Nobel Peace Prize winner, and unwilling to accept calls, international calls for cessation of hostilities. But at the same time, also going into a national election come Monday. What is this doing to the body politics of Ethiopia? This is one point that I like to focus on. The other is the lack thereof in the domestic narrative in Ethiopia, and that includes the media and the government-sponsored narrative, which completely does not take into consideration the people of Tigray, and hence overly reliant on the political dynamics between the TPLF and the federal government. The scenes of the TPLF of the 27 years and the helplessness of the federal government in dealing with the TPLF. This is the overall narrative. And what is the most impactful effect of this narrative is that it completely cancels more than 6 million people of the Tigray regional states out of the equation. So these two dynamics are eventually leading into a failure in a transformation of the politics under the leadership of Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, which would see a united Ethiopia, a unified Ethiopia, and a prosperous Ethiopia. So here is the reason. The very fact that the government refused to heed the international calls for cessation of hostilities rests its narrative in the idea that the government considers the TPLF as a non-existing entity. And hence, in fact, the TPLF has been labeled as a terrorist organization by the parliament, which did not have representatives of the Tigrayan regional states in and of itself. So the government considers that getting into cessation of hostilities or getting into an agreement to enforce cessation of hostilities requires two parties on equal footing to agree to something. So because of that, the government is refusing to allow cessation of hostilities. This in itself is because the government and its supporters are completely disconnected with the dynamics of the war that is ongoing, which according to the government is happening in a very sporadic areas. The last account is 2 hotspots that the government needs to deal with. And it completely forgets that this war, this law enforcement, which has turned into a civil war, has turned into a rebellion by the Tigrayan people against the Ethiopian state. This dynamics is missing from the analysis of the government and from the understanding of the government and its supporters from the space in itself, which would not force the government to accept cessation of hostilities. And this is why this war is not going to be over anytime, because for any close observer of what's happening in the dynamics there, this has turned into a war of the people of Tigray against the state of Ethiopia. It has turned into a full-blown rebellion. And getting into or accepting international calls for cessation of hostilities requires the bare minimum of recognizing the nature and the dynamics of this war. And if we do not do that, and if we assume the war with a complete understanding of there's going to be a loser and there's going to be a winner, and the winner is the federal government and the loser is the TPLF, we will not be in a position to seek for cessation of hostilities. That in turn means the grim statistics that Alex Dawal mentioned earlier will not have an end in sight. We are poised to see the death of thousands and thousands of people because of hunger. We're also going to see a complete obliteration of the Tigrayan economy. As Tamrat said, the impact, he mentioned it earlier, the impact, we will see the more aggravated version of that. We would also see a lot more suffering and death of civilians because of the ongoing war. So this in turn is having a very heavy weight on the way and the shape of the Ethiopian state. The Ethiopian state, that's the oldest in Africa, even going by the state narrative itself, is up for a very vicious rupture, because this spoiled politics is not imagining the reintegration of the Tigrayan population into the body politics of the Ethiopian state. We are headed into, going into the second point, we are headed into an election the coming Monday, an election that is not only happening in Tigray, but also has no prospect whatsoever as to when it's going to happen. It means after the election, Ethiopia will embark on a formation of a new state. And nobody has neither the legal nor the constitutional argument as to how the people of Tigray are going to be represented into becoming a member of this newly being reconstituted Ethiopian state after the election. And this leaves the prospect of the political participation of the entire population of the Tigray regional state in limbo. And it will further push the people into giving up on the idea of the Ethiopian state in itself. And this is the risk we are running by refusing to stop the war. In addition, of course, of prolonging the suffering of the people. A lot of people are arguing today on the side of the government, saying if the TPLF could stop fighting, the war will be over. So the TPLF should surrender and the war can be over, so the political process can start. Again, this will return me back to the point that I mentioned earlier. This dismisses the dynamics of this war, which has morphed into a full-blown rebellion against the Ethiopian state. So if we do not have an understanding and a reading, an honest reading of the nature of the war that's happening today, we will be having a very violent fracture of the Ethiopian state as we go by reforming and forming a new state after the election. So this is the political fallout, in addition to, of course, the humanitarian crisis that Alex Dawal actually pointed out. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that further political dimension internally and the impact in both Tigray and Ethiopia more generally. And so, Tamara, to turn now to you for your presentation.
Okay, I think I have to, it's customary to thank, do you hear me? Just checking.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. Usually it's customary to thank for participation in such kind of forums, but I think I have to give special thanks for the organizers, given the pressure they were under not to include me. Let me start by saying that. And second of all, speaking in this refugee week is very personal to me because I've been exiled for 9 years. And at the same time, after coming back, hoping that my country will be better, seeing over 3 million people displaced, seeing war coming back to the northern Ethiopia, which is Tigray and Eritrea area where my father died as a soldier of Ethiopian government when I was 8 years old. Seeing the same thing happening, probably in its worst form, is very personal and depressingly saddening, to be honest. So I speak from that point of view. When I speak from that point of view, I want to speak, how did we get here? And how do we get out of here? Because unless we come to the account of finding the true account on how we got here, just like we are here like the 1980s, 10 years down the road, or even a few years down the road, we might be seeing even a worse situation. And the common narrative that is repeatedly being seen in the Western media, Western academics, even on this event note that was distributed for everyone, has a specific kind of accounting the current situation in Tigray and in Ethiopia in general. It says the current situation is entirely man-made, the direct outcome of our belligerence in the war, specifically the Ethiopian Federal Forces, the Eritrean National Army, and the militia from the neighboring Amhara region. Campaign for starvation is the cause, the event note says. I'm not denying the existence of this crime. No one in his or her mind will deny that starvation or any kind of crime is being committed in such kind of war. But what I'm very concerned, and what is actually concerning many Ethiopians, is that there is no mention of even TPLF. Even from our presenters, only Sadala mentioned TPLF. Why? Because TPLF have been in force, in power, in that region and in Ethiopia entirely for over 35 years. TPLF was responsible for the politics, economy, military, security, apparatus and operation of Ethiopia. TPLF was responsible for the current ethnic federalism system by designing it. TPLF was responsible as a partner with EPLF for the creation of Eritrean state. And now, if we see the narrative, it seems like the Amhara forces, the Ethiopian forces, the Eritrean forces just descended on Tigray and started violence and crime just for the fun of it. No, that's not how it happened. That's not what's going on. We have to see the system, the institutions, the interests, the reasons that got us here so that we can reform or change and to create a better solution, a better region, both for Ethiopia and Eritrea and Tigray. Otherwise, this kind of activist sayings that only the crime is being committed against Tigrayans is not going to help anyone. So why mention TPLF? I raise three reasons why discussing the role of TPLF and how to integrate the next change is important, because the creation of and the nature of the current Eritrean state is directly linked to TPLF. TPLF was responsible, part like EPLF, for the liberation of Eritrea or cessation of Eritrea from Ethiopia, and by that creating a landlocked Ethiopia, primarily a neighboring Tigray state. That would be a major reason. The second reason, in 2000, when Ethiopia and Eritrea got into war, TPLF did not finish the war either by military means or either by coming up with a new political economy order for both countries. So it created an Eritrea that is hostile to Tigray and Ethiopia in general. It left it in a problematic condition. Second, it created the ethnic federalism that we're in now. This ethnic federalism gave us the Amhara region, which never was before TPLF came into power. It gave us the Amhara special forces. So how are we going to ignore TPLF's role in creating the evils that are currently abusing Tigrayans and Ethiopians in every part? This is the two major roles of TPLF in creating the condition that made Tigray hell today. Third, when political reforms started happening, currently led by Abiy Ahmed, TPLF failed to adapt itself to the current situation for two reasons. First, the ethnic federalism it created does not allow for a compromised outcome. It created each ethnic state in such a pitting situation where one has to win to survive. TPLF's rule in Ethiopia has been, I have everything in economy, the military, the intelligence, but nobody has anything. And yet, the two major regions, Oromia and Amhara region, have been antagonized. This is in discourse, in education, in the laws, and at the same time, in the entire political economy structure. As such, when reform came, TPLF did not have a structure. It has already trapped itself and the Tigrayan people in a situation where they have to win all or lose all. This was the reason TPLF failed to adapt, even though repeated attempts were made by Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed. One of the things you can't blame him is he's been sending elders, he's been trying to negotiate. TPLF rebuffed all opportunity to negotiate. And it instigated this war. And it is actively part of the belligerents that are committing crime. In the 1980s, there are repeated evidences that TPLF have used food aid, starvation, to make money out of it and gain control for weapons. So how do we get out of here? There are three things we must do. First of all, the current situation is not only an Ethiopian affair, it's an Eritrean affair too. So a new political order for Ethiopia and Eritrea is necessary. Second, we need to reform the ethnic federalism we're in. Otherwise, no kind of compromise for no one will work. A comprehensive reform is required. Third, simply belligerent, blaming the Ethiopian government or imposing sanctions on the Ethiopian government will not work. The international community must accept that TPLF is no more part of the entire Ethiopian political body. That time is gone. It's part to recognize that and come up with a viable political options from Tigrayans that will represent them better than TPLF. TPLF's option to be part of the Ethiopian body politics is over, I'm sorry. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you again for another perspective on that. So we've had multiple different views, I think, and different accounts of the conflict, of the political situation, of the economic situation, of the humanitarian type situation. And so clearly many different points for discussion between the different presenters. And so first thing I'd say is whether people would like to respond to anything any of the other presenters have said. But I would like to throw in a sort of couple of particular points that have really struck me as well. There's been a lot of focus, obviously, on the various belligerent parties. But what is also very, very clear is that this is a war, a conflict against the civilians. It is the civilians who are being targeted in multiple different ways, leading to the desperate humanitarian situation, mass starvation, famine. And I would like to ask, as an outsider, what lies in the definitions of these various situations? What is, I understand now that there are degrees or levels of food insecurity that have been identified, with famine as the most serious level of food insecurity. But it seems that there is a great reluctance, particularly among the international community, to use the word famine. So what flows from understanding the situation as a famine, and what is lost by not doing so? I'm a lawyer, and I sort of think, well, is this a matter of definition? And so we can get sort of tied up in semantics rather than in understanding the realities of what is really going on. And it seems to me that that is something that underlies a lot of what everybody has been saying. So Would people like to, who would like to go first in terms of either or both responding to what other speakers have said and perhaps responding to what I have just said? Alex, I think. And
let me start with the famine definition. There is no accepted legal definition of famine. And there is no, but it carries a weight. And the famine of 1984-85 was a huge stigma on a generation of Ethiopians. Ethiopia was associated with those deeply humiliating images, and the fact that Ethiopia was reliant on international humanitarian aid was, I think, something that Ethiopians really sought to free themselves from. And I think there are many legitimate criticisms of the EPRDF in their years in government. I mean, they called it democracy. It was nothing approaching democracy. The one achievement that they really did, they can claim, was the conquest of famine. And this was laid out right at the beginning in 1991, when Meles Zenawi, then before he even took office, was asked in his very first press conference, what was your ambition for your time in office? He said, let Ethiopians eat 3 meals a day. And 6 years ago, in response to the largest ever food crisis in Ethiopia, the largest ever shortfall, the government mounted the most effective, expeditious, and most effective response. It was led by then Deputy Prime Minister Demeke Mekonnen, who is now Foreign Minister and a prominent figure. And for those of you who see me as I'm commonly identified as a friend of TPLF, I have consistently given the credit to Demeke for leading that most efficacious relief effort in Ethiopia's history ever. What it is particularly tragic that a government that has shown itself capable, that was when he was in EPRDF, now he's in Prosperity Party, but it's the same individual, same infrastructure, same capacity, same knowledge, same skills. They're doing the reverse. Now, is it a famine? Is it not a famine? The international community put itself in a little trap here, because there is those of us who've been studying famine for many years tend to use a historical cutoff point, 100,000 excess deaths. That's a famine. But you don't want to have to wait till you count the deaths. So a system was put in place where you can do a real-time assessment using various different indicators of malnutrition, of mortality, of the food economy. And those who are involved within the Ethiopian government were desperate for it not to be declared a famine. And they were trying through various means to have various methodological criteria for saying that this particular criteria of 20% of the population in a particular zone being in famine conditions is not going to be met. And their arguments are going backwards and forwards as to whether 20% in particular zones. But the fact is that 350,000 people are in famine conditions, and that is a very conservative estimate. And that is what the United Nations Humanitarian Aid Coordinator, Mark Lowcock, has used as his basis for saying this is famine. There's no question about it, because those who cannot be accessed by this government survey mechanism are likely in worse situation. So Ethiopia is sliding back into the issue where the situation where it is in famine. And it is a man-made famine. Let me make 2 other points here. One is, yes.
Can you make them quickly then, Alex?
Very quickly. All parties are responsible for the war. No one, including myself, has ever tried to absolve TPLF from its responsibility. But the war crimes are overwhelmingly, the starvation crimes are overwhelmingly by Eritrean, Ethiopian government and Amhara forces. Mark Lowcock last week said, yes, all sides are responsible. 131 access violations, 130 by the Ethiopian, Eritrean forces, 1 by TDF. Yes, so all sides are responsible. It is not symmetrical. And very final point in response to Tamrat. Yes, Abiy did reach out. One of the elders who went backwards and forwards was a very prominent Tigrayan national hero, General Tzadkan Gebretensai. He spoke on the radio just a few days ago. He left the TPLF 20 years ago, criticized it for its lack of democracy. He was trying to avoid a war.
Just interrupted. I'm not hearing Alex.
Oh. He tried to avoid a war. He, like many others of his generation who had left TPLF, rejoined the armed forces. He, on a radio broadcast last week, made it very clear, this is not TPLF fighting, this is the Tigrayan people fighting. As Sadali said, the crimes committed, the atrocities committed have mobilized the Tigrayan people. The TPLF is even a small part of this now. Have mobilized the people in anger against both the Eritrean government and the Ethiopian state. And a political solution needs to be found to this. Let me stop there. We can discuss more later.
Okay, who would like to come in?
I'm very sorry. I'm very sorry. I didn't hear anything Alex said when he was, because of my network. Thanks for Ethiopian Telecom for the network interruption. But if Alex could repeat or summarize what he was saying after as a response for my case. Sorry, Alex, and sorry for the organizers.
Yeah, I was just explaining that one of the elders who was intermediating between Abiy and the TPLF was General Tzadkan.
Yes.
And he was on the radio the other day, and he blamed both sides, but particularly Abiy for the breakdown. And he made the point that we all know him as a critic of TPLF. He left TPLF 20 years ago. He rejoined the armed struggle because the survival of the people of Tigray was at risk.
Thank you.
Okay, so Tigray, are you wanting to, Tamarat, would you like to come in?
Yeah, what my concern, yes, he's right. We can blame all sides, or we can even blame Abiy himself for the way he conducted the negotiations or the peace process before the start of the war. But we can't simply say all parts are to be blamed without accounting the main party, which had all the cards at his hand before all things fall apart. And now we have to deal with the structures, not with individuals or with the some people in power, or with just Isaias or Abiy or just TPLF. The reason I say TPLF is not just the individuals, but if people like Tzadkan or any Tigrayan that believes the people of Tigray are in danger, let me just take their case and say they are in danger. What is the best way? One of the solutions I keep hearing is, even Sadala mentioned, is that there will be a new Tigrayan state. Oh, please, the Eritreans tried it. 30 plus years, what did we get? You think Tigray, which is going to be hostile both to Eritrea and Ethiopia as a state, is going to be a solution for anybody? What kind of state that would be? With landlocked? And first of all,
Sorry to interrupt you, Tamrat, my friend. I did not say there will be a new state. I'm saying the Ethiopian politics must be able to reimagine the Tigrayans into its body politics so that we have
Let me finish.
the country full.
Sorry.
Yeah,
I'm not advocating for a new Tigrayan state.
Okay,
but there are those
and then into Sadali, right?
Yeah, okay. So this is my concern. How do we get out of the kind of hardened rock place that I see everybody is in? With even the framing of this discussion is focused just on the Tigray crisis. But I see the crisis not only just as a Tigray crisis, but as an Ethio-Eritrean crisis that engulfs the entire region. If we have to have a solution, it has to include all the major parties. Amhara nationalism was not at the stage currently when TPLF was in power. Amhara nationalism is now at its highest level, armed. And this was done by the ethnic federalism and by TPLF. Unless we accommodate all voices by simply pressuring the Ethiopian government or the Eritrean government, denying visas or putting restrictions or simply demanding access to the Tigrayans, we will lose the focus. Yes, we need access to the humanitarian case. Yes, we need to address the refugee crisis. Yes, we need to address sexual violence and other war crimes. But the focus should be, how do we get out of here, all of us?
Okay.
That's my case. Thank you.
Thank you, Tamarat. So Sadali, did you want to come back in, and Tamarat as well?
I would like to briefly
keep remarks quite short. Yeah.
Yeah, I would like to briefly say something about the problematic approach of my colleague Tamarat in putting the TPLF front and center in this. There are two arguments that have compounded this problem and hence deprived us of coming up with a solution now. Number one is, as Tamarat said, TPLF was not only responsible for running the state for 27 years, but also to reconfiguring the Ethiopian state as we know it now. The federal arrangement we have, TPLF has been there, but TPLF was not the only party to govern the country 27. Yes, it was a dominant force. In fact, if we wanted to solve this problem today, one of the things that the government is so determined and its supporters are so determined not to see is any involvement by the TPLF in any form whatsoever. That involvement, the government's move to label the TPLF as a terrorist organization. We want to come out of this as a whole. I don't see how we can do that by labeling TPLF as a terrorist organization. And Tamarat, you yourself is an advocate of that. In fact, you were saying it needed to be done in the back, long ago. But if we wanted to come out of that, we need to come as a whole. And that is why we need to sit down. If we want to reconfigure the state, change the constitution, whatever we wanted to do, that the federation continues, Ethiopia continues as a one state, they have to become part of the solution and not just the problem alone. So this discursive violence that the Ethiopian government propagated in the beginning, putting TPLF as the mastermind of every ill the country finds itself today, deprived two things. Number one, political solution is nowhere to be seen today because that political solution should involve TPLF. Number two, the people of Tigray have voted for this party. What are we going to do? What do we do? Where are the people of Tigray in this? How can we bring them front and center in this argument and give them an opportunity? What do you want to do with this party that you have elected? How do you want to be represented in the Ethiopian state? Should we not give that opportunity to the people of Tigray instead of speaking on their behalf in their absence? This is the most dangerous approach that is depriving us of a peaceful solution out of this crisis, in my opinion.
Okay, thank you again. Can the other Tamarat? We'll come back later, but I think try to bring Tamarat back into the conversation as well. Is there anything that you would like to add?
Thank you, Christine. I want to say this. In this conflict, I don't see one side an agent of good, the other side a genius of evil. None of them are either. It's a conflict that is there, and it has to be dealt with. War is a very expensive enterprise. Somebody has to pay for it. Considering everything is normal, and Ethiopia has been on economic growth for the 15 years since the mid 2000s, it was not possible to generate enough jobs to absorb the useful demography that's putting a lot of pressure on the economy. You're dealing with more than 23 million young Ethiopians that do not have a prospect for a dignified and hopeful life. When you add war in this situation, somebody has to pay for it. And as far as I'm concerned, Tigray will continue to be a hole in the Ethiopian national economy. It undermines the government's very policy of liberalization and economic reform, because the whole idea was to pull the government out of the economy to provide opportunity for the private sector. Now the government has to deeply get involved in the micro management of the economy, because they will have to set a national priority to be able to win this protracted war. And then the more they get involved in that, the more they will be spending on the war. I mean, every bullet that's being fired is a dollar that's being burnt. And this will continue to be the case unless there is a broader political settlement. I'm not necessarily talking about a conflict in Tigray, because the problem of Ethiopia today is not only Tigray. There is a whole lot of political crisis that's going on, and there has to be a political settlement. And for that to happen, there should be a meaningful, inclusive negotiation and compromise. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There's obviously a lot of different views coming out. There's also now a lot of questions coming in from the audience on various aspects that are not necessarily related to the direct political issues that have just been being talked about. So what I suggest I'll do is give 2 or 3 of these questions, allow each of you then to respond to whichever of the questions that you would like to do so. And then as we get towards the end of the time, allow everybody a minute to sum up on their particular points, if that's satisfactory to you all. So
should I speak now, or are you going to give me a chance?
As I say, I'll give you a chance both to respond to the questions from the audience, and then at the very end to respond generally to anything that you want to do. So if that is satisfactory to you. So audience questions from different people. And as I say, they're coming from a number of different angles, not necessarily related to the political discussion that you've just been having. So one is that if the UN Security Council does not reach any consensus, how can the UN ensure that communities can move freely to access humanitarian assistance? Or I think we could also reverse that. If the Security Council is not acting in any concerted fashion to mandate any particular action, how can the those providing humanitarian assistance, how can they ensure access, as well as how can people access the humanitarian assistance that they are offering? Another person is asking, where is any threat of international economic sanctions coming from? Basically, there's been silence from the G7, the UN, the United States, the EU, etc. So, I mean, is economic sanction actually a real threat? And I think, again, I would add, and what would that serve? Is economic sanction an appropriate response in a situation of this sort? And then another question goes back to the issues I was raising, really. We know that conflict is very frequently a vector of food insecurity. We might add in the current situation that it's also a vector for disease and spreading COVID, for example. It's also been touched upon, but we know the association of armed conflict and sexual violence, and the use of sexual violence as a weapon of war. So we get these various factors all coming in with armed conflict. So is it sensible? Can we distinguish between a man-made famine, as it's been called, and the kind of situations that emerge from conflict more generally? So the food insecurity, the sexual violence, etc., all of which come naturally from conflict. So if people would like to think about, though the presenters, all of you, would like to think about answering some of those questions that are coming from the audience. And then, as I said, I'll return back to each of you if you want to make sort of final comment on the issue as a whole. So I choose which ones you would like to respond to, all or any. Maybe we'll go in a slightly different order this time. So Dali, would you like to start on any of the questions from the audience?
Yeah, I like to address the pressure from the international community. A lot of people are reacting, of course, to the threats and the strong-worded statements that are being issued by the international community. But let's not forget that the international community is reacting the way it's reacting today, be it the transatlantic alliance that's being strengthened as we speak now, or individual countries in EU or in the US, after 7 months of waiting. Remember, the Prime Minister first branded this mission as a law enforcement that would not take more than a few weeks. The UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has been by a phone, and I have this information, assured by the Prime Minister to get just 10 days to complete this mission. So the international community was completely on the side of the prime minister initially. In fact, for the 7 months, in fact, even today, I would say they are on the side of the Ethiopian government by not taking any concrete measure and just issuing strongly worded statements. And the visa restriction is the one concrete steps that has been taken so far. So this came after 7 months of waiting, not just for a law enforcement to end, but also the egregious involvement of the Eritrean government. The Eritrean government involvement now is the international community understands that. And I think Prime Minister Abiy has made it in a couple of private conversations with high-level officials that he is unable to enforce the withdrawal of the Eritrean forces from our own territory. This is one of the most alarming issues that the international community is dealing with today, because there is no mechanism the international community could hold Eritrea to account for the crimes that it has committed. No sanctions can work because Eritrea has already been there. So the international community now is trying to pressure Ethiopia, because Ethiopia, unlike Eritrea, is a part and parcel of the international community. We do have a robust diplomatic engagement with the rest of the world. So diplomatic pressure is all that is there to it today. There is no forceful enforcement of this pressure as we speak now. So I would say the international community is still on the side of Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, who's helplessly sitting back and watching Eritrea ravaging its own country. So what is the alternative to stop this? Because we are looking at the deaths of thousands of people in weeks from now. And Ethiopia, by involving Eritrea, has lost its argument of the right for sovereignty and everything, because a neighboring state is ravaging the civilians in a sovereign state. So this has become not Ethiopia's issue of sovereignty anymore. It has become a matter of saving lives. And I would say the international community has a responsibility to even become more forceful in its engagement with the Ethiopian government to make sure at least the withdrawal of the Eritrean forces from Tigray, at least, if not, a cessation of hostilities. That has to come yet. And I don't see it as an aggressive move by the international community yet.
Thank you. And Tamarat?
May I respond? Yes.
Briefly, yes, briefly.
Yes, briefly.
Briefly, but if you could focus on the questions that came from the audience as well, please.
Okay. Yes. At the same time, I would like to comment the other Tamrat on the cost of conflict. One of the failures of Ethiopian elite has been resolving political crisis without conflict. This is where everybody is to be blamed primarily. And the cost of it is, even though Ethiopia has never been out of the woods of securing food for herself, it has never reached the stage of famine. And that's one of the reasons this war is very dark, that we're back again into the discourse of famine. Yet, on the international community pressure about the question from the audience, I don't think the current pressure is on the right track to help the situation in a better direction. The best thing to do is to work with the Ethiopian government no matter what, because the international community's interventionist approach, to the point of discussing, some kind of military intervention to help what is going on in Tigray, would create another Yugoslavia in a capacity we've never seen, like in hundreds of millions of people. So I'm so happy to see that the Tigray rehabilitation project is now on. The Ethiopian government, in cooperation with development partners, have started to work with the Ethiopian government, specifically focused on rehabilitating the Tigray region. But I see this situation foiling in two parts. First of all, there is no discussion of reforming the entire ethnic federalism. Second, yes, there is a discussion of withdrawing the Eritrean forces. But I see another war between Ethiopia and Eritrea on the horizon, because there is no specific reform agenda on Eritrea. Even nobody is engaging Eritrean opposition forces. Nobody is now talking about democratic process and what Eritrea would look like post-Isaias Afwerki. We have another big assignment coming right in front of us. So whatever discussion we're having, we should include the Eritrean Ethiopian political economy and structure. At the same time, the third thing, TPLF will never come back. No Ethiopian in his right mind will live under a condition, any political operation where TPLF has one single seat. No, that day is over. Of all the things, of all the evil that has come out of the Tigrayan war, the end of TPLF days is the best thing that ever happened for Ethiopia. But how do we incorporate Tigray? That's a major question. I think one of the most ignored but smart ideas that I've ever heard from anyone, both in Ethiopia and international community, came from Ambassador Tibor Nagy, who has a wide experience in Ethiopia and Africa in general. He suggested forming a new political party that does not include any of the previous members of TPLF, with the consent of the Tigrayan elite. Now, this may not be the absolute answer, but at least this is one of the answers I see to engage the Tigrayan elite. And yes, their cost has been high now that they will demand higher costs to incorporate into the body politics. But no matter what, that's the route. TPLF is gone. I just want to say that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Alex, any responses to any of the audience questions?
So let me take, there's a very interesting distinction on the third point you made between a man-made famine and a famine related to food insecurity and conflict. And here I would refer to, there was a lawyer called David Marcus who wrote a very interesting but rather neglected paper on famine crimes. And he had a 4-level scale of, one is famines in which there is no culpability at all, so they're not crimes. Second are famines where there is official neglect, the government fails to respond. A third is where a famine is a foreseeable outcome of policy or military action. So it is not the intent, it is but the foreseeable outcome, the third level. And we see that, for example, in Yemen, in South Sudan, it's quite common. The fourth, which is very rare, is starvation as a deliberate policy of extermination or genocide. And there are very, very few cases of that. But the evidence that we have from Tigray today of troops going round to villages and going to the level of saying to the farmers, you will not plant, you will not harvest, you will not get food aid, we will punish you if you do. Our intent is to see you starve to death. We have not heard that really for decades. And this would put that famine, the current famine, in that very special, terrible category. And there is, I think, one of the things that is very striking about the Ethiopian national political discourse at the level of Addis Ababa is a total denial or near total denial about the gravity of what is happening and the responsibility for it today. It is almost as though Ethiopia is a great nation of 120 million people, therefore we can dispose of a small part of it, 5 million people, and no one will really mind or notice. Or that there is one political party there and it can be eradicated and its followers eradicated and it won't matter. It is an extraordinary narrative that is a denial of a basic humanity. And it is a deeply, deeply disturbing one, because those who adopt that narrative will, and the ethics associated with it are terrible in themselves, but also will come back to be inflicted on the rest of Ethiopia. Imagine what it means for those military units, those young people who have been involved in perpetrating these crimes, when they come back to wherever they come from in the rest of Ethiopia. What kind of people, what kind of citizens, what kind of military officers or law enforcement officials are they going to be? So the other two questions, I'm going to push one to Tamrat Gebramariam, which is what might the Magnitsky sanctions do? and I'm going to ask Tamrat to answer that. And the other is, no one has yet talked about military intervention, but the current logic of ongoing war and this type of deaths on this sort of scale is actually going to challenge the conscience of the international community. What do we do in a situation where we are facing, potentially hundreds of thousands of deaths of children? Let me, those who somehow seem to think that it's only, TPLF leaders starving. It is children who are starving. What does this mean for the conscience of the world? What type of action will follow?
So, Tamara, the issue of economic sanctions that Alex and I was equally going to say, well, had you got some thoughts around that?
Yeah, that's what I was hoping to address. Basically, the threat for the economic sanction comes from the transatlantic alliance, which is Europeans and the US government. Already there are signs where between the two, close to $290 million in aid was already suspended. The US was carried on from the Trump administration time, where there was a displeasure about Ethiopia's government policy in relation to the GERD, but that carried on. And the EU's support to the Ethiopian government that was amounting to $90 million. But more importantly, the IMF was supposed to provide a little over $400 million disbursement into the agreement they have made about 2 years ago, or a year and a half ago, to provide special drawing rights for Ethiopia, close to $3 billion. That was to support the balance of payment of the Ethiopia's government, which is really going alarmingly low, because Ethiopia is now has a foreign currency reserve that is equal to pay for a little over 2 months imports, which is about $14 billion or $15 billion. In any average year, Ethiopia has a deficit of about $5 billion in balance of payments. And that's quite a crisis, because it depreciated the birr against major currencies. Now, the birr is exchanged for 44.1 birr against a dollar. And the depreciation over the last 2 years has been on average 35%. I have covered the Ethiopian economy for close to 20 plus years. I have never seen the birr losing value in the last 2-3 years as it has been the previous 20 years. So the balance of payment crisis is quite major. But what I see the transatlantic alliance doing is signaling. I have not seen yet a major economic sanction. They have not used any instrument to that degree. The act Alex has just mentioned, the Magnitsky Act, is a U.S. act that punish countries who are dealing with a country that has been imposed with that act. It has not been activated yet, but there is a threat, and the threat depends on the behavior of the authorities in Addis Ababa, unless they budge or relent to the demand from the transatlantic alliance. When we speak of international community, we're basically talking about Europe and the US in this case, and they have a very specific demand, 4 or 5. Out of this, the two thorny issues are ceasefire or cessation of hostilities, and the immediate verifiable withdrawal of Eritrean forces. If the Ethiopian government is not able to ensure that, I think there is a considerable credible threat that the transatlantic alliance will move to the economic sanctions and the Magnitsky Act. And but as we speak, those have not been activated yet, unless a pressure here and there, just to signal an important message to the Ethiopian government that the transatlantic alliance is quite serious about what they're talking about.
Thank you. We are running out of time. Just only got just slightly over 5 minutes. So in line with my promise, what I will do is allow each of you now to make one or at the most two sort of final points that you would really like to do. And I'll go in the reverse order of your original presentations. So Tamarat Negera, would you like to, just to say, make a couple of one or at the most two final points that you would like to leave us with?
Thank you for the opportunity. The point I would like to make, the major point I would like to make, whatever the international community wants to work in the Horn of Africa, it rather work with the Ethiopian state rather than excluding it and pressuring it in a manner that would make it embrace other forces, including the Eritrean government. Second, the solution the international community has for the Horn of Africa or for the region or for Ethiopia or Tigrayan situation should include the Eritrean state's future rather than simply demanding the Eritrean forces to withdraw. That's my final point. Thank you.
Thank you, and made very nice and briefly. And Sadali, if you would also like to make your final one or 2 points.
Thank you for the opportunity. Just to briefly say, I think any solution that is looking into solving the crisis in Tigray today must begin and must put the people of Tigray front and center. By what I see now is an exclusion of the people of Tigray from the solution. The federal government is speaking on behalf of the hurting. The people of Tigray are the ones that are bearing the brunt of this war, and any solution that is excluding them is not going to work out. So whether they want to choose their own political party, whether they want to, how they want to, reintegrate themselves into the Ethiopian politics, whether it's about ending the war, we must put the people of Tigray front and center. Without that, there is no solution. As to the Eritrean, Ethiopia cannot have Eritrea as an albatross around its neck. Ethiopia can deal with Eritrea as a neighboring and sovereign state, but the first priority should be the complete, verifiable and swift withdrawal of Eritrean forces from the sovereign land of Ethiopia. After that, any political agreement should be conducted as an agreement between two sovereign states, neighboring sovereign states. We cannot carry the burden of Eritrea's failure around our neck and try to come out of it a winner. Thank you.
Thank you. Tamarat?
Thank you. The war in Tigray is a mishandled political crisis, and it can only have a political resolution. But there are other political crises elsewhere in the country. And as long as this militarized conflicts elsewhere and the war in Tigray is not going to be resolved anytime soon, I'm afraid Ethiopia does not have an economy that can carry war and conflict. Somebody has to pay for this conflict, this war, and Ethiopia is not in a situation to do that. As the case has always been, 1/4 of Ethiopia's budget is always covered by external loans and grants, and a country that is at loggerheads with its development partners will not be able to carry an economy on its own, even without conflicts. And when you add conflict into the situation, it's just adding fuel to the fire. And that's one point I want to make. The second point I want to make is that I'm afraid that Ethiopia is going back to what development economists call the development trap. And this trap is that Professor Paul Collier from Oxford usually puts 4 points or 4 criteria to define a country that is in a development trap, where there is conflict, where a country relies on natural resources, when a country is landlocked and not have a friendly neighbors around, and when there is bad governance, a country is in a development trap. And looking at Ethiopia in this matrix, you can see that what has been not around for a long time was a militarized conflict and war. That is back into the picture. And I'm afraid that Ethiopia is moving into a development trap and trying to pull it out from such a trap. We've seen how long it took from the early 1990s. And I'm afraid that it may take another generation to be able to put Ethiopia in the map Alex was mentioning earlier, how in 2015, Ethiopia was able to overcome a massive drought that involved 20 million people of its population. And it was for the first time that Ethiopia paid 70% of the fund that was needed to pay for the emergency responses during that time. It was a remarkable achievement. And it's quite interesting to note that at the height of that process, Deputy Prime Minister Demeka was in charge of running that show. Every Ethiopian should have taken a great sense of pride from such an accomplishment, but that did not happen overnight. It took a comprehensive, combined, rigorous effort of 30 years for a country to be able to position itself to respond in such manner. But now going back to a development trap and taking another 30 years to come out of it, it's a very worrying, alarming development. Thank you.
Thank you. And Alex, final word.
So I think 2 points, as you suggested. The first is the moral point, which is that it is. I think we must, with all the politics, let us not lose sight of the ethics of preventing needless deaths from starvation and disease of people who are entirely innocent of the political and military decisions made. And it's a test for Ethiopians, it's a test for the international community. But it's also a political test, because if the famine unfolds as I fear it will, as every indication is that it will, this will not be just a sort of road bump on the future to Ethiopia. This will be the road bump that actually breaks Ethiopia economically and breaks it politically. One of the things that we must never forget is that the hurt and the grievance of a man-made famine lasts for generations. We saw that in Ireland, we saw that in Ukraine, and we are seeing it unfolding today in Tigray.
Thank you. And we are, exactly on time. So all it remains is to thank all of you for that very rich, very difficult conversation in many ways, and very clearly the complexity coupled with the huge, as Alex has just put it, moral dilemma for the international community in how best to respond to stop an appalling situation from getting worse, and how to ameliorate the whole situation. So thank you all very much indeed for participating in this event. I'd like to thank the audience very much for their questions as well. And again, from the question and answers come up, I think a realization again of the complexity of the different issues. I remember Alex started off by saying it's actually very simple and can be broken down simply, but nevertheless, I think the many different narratives and complexities have also emerged. So to thank the audience, and also, of course, to thank the African Institute at the LSE for hosting the event. So thank you all very much, and I hope you